topic that you're interested in, all right? And so you don't need to, you know, there's a lot of things that you can take as assumed knowledge if you understand the audience, all right? So it's important that you don't waste time writing about things that are self-evident. I'll say that comment about rice because I've heard so many proposals over the years, students working on rice, and the first thing they tell me is rice is really important. It's eaten by millions of people around the world. Yeah, I know that, okay? So you don't have to tell those, and you can just, there's whatever context you're working in, there'll be a set of knowledge that you can assume, given that we're all working in the same field, all right? So use your words, use that space effectively. And again, you know, in a real world situation, if I'm writing a proposal to people who I can assume that already know that, it's an easy way to turn people off. All right, they go, oh, I don't want to read anymore. And that goes in the pile, I might read later pile, I'll read the next one. All right. The materials and methods are the most important part of the proposal because that actually documents what you're going to do. So the introduction talks about why you're going to do it, why is it important, where does it fit in the current state of knowledge, and the materials and methods part tells you about how you're going to do it, where you're going to do it, when is it going to be done, what methods you're going to do. All right. So you have to demonstrate that the approach that you're using is scientifically valid and that the design is adequate to address your research questions. So you use evidence from the literature to support that. All right. So you have to provide a description of how you plan to implement the research. So this is often in time and space and where the place is, what you plan to do, all right? And also provide some explanation of why you want to do it that way, all right? Why you've selected these particular methodologies, all right? This particular set of constraints or design parameters. And again, use evidence from the literature to support those design decisions that you document in your proposal. So you have to provide details of methods, sampling, materials. If you're going to have questionnaires, put the questionnaire in your thing. If you've got surveys, what are the survey questions? What are the procedures? What's the equipment they're going to do? What type of data you're going to collect? Think about how it's going to be analysed, but we don't require that in a lot of detail because often you don't know. But if you have got some good ideas about how you're going to analyse the data, put it in. But again, if you're not really sure, it's better to leave it out than put something, oh, we're going to put it in Excel. And you know, if you're not sure, just leave it out. All right, I'm not expecting to do much on the data analysis side. But in a normal proposal, you should also think about how the data will be analysed. Some things you can put in an appendix, you know, you might, or in tables, you know, things like lists of equipment. If you got a questionnaire that you developed, you can put the questionnaire in an appendix. All right. So think about what's the most appropriate way to present that information, whether you should put it into a table and figure, maybe put it in an appendix, all right? And remember also that you need to write at a detail that potentially could be read. So if I read that proposal, I could potentially go off and implement it, all right? So it has to be sufficient detail that, so that don't leave, make sure that all the information, all the steps are in there. So it could be read by someone who's reasonably informed in the area that you're working in and could actually implement the project. So I said for this, you also, rather than, as well as describe what you plan to do, you must provide some rationale and evidence to support why you've made those decisions. All right. It's important that you include, you use the published literature, so you have to have a reference list, all right? And so you have to include a list of all the literature that you've cited in your proposal, and the reference list has to be in Harvard style, Harvard-Gatton style, both in the in-text, the way you use in-text citations, and the way you generate the reference list. The reference list should be in author date order, so sorted alphabetically by author, and then by date. So if you have two publications by the same author, you would put the earliest publication first and the latest publication second. All right? So you sort first by author. So if their last name starts with A, they're at the top. If it starts with a Z, they're at the bottom. If you have two publications by the same author, well, usually you sort on the second author. So you sort on the first author, then you sort on the second author. If the two publications have the same author, then you sort on date. All right. Include the full citation. So we want you to include all the authors, the full journal name. All right. So don't abbreviate the journal name. So write out in words, like Canadian Journal of Surgery, for instance. So that's the one that don't put Can J Surge. All right. Write out the full name. All right. Those are the things. Make sure it's in the right format. Make sure you haven't copied over formatting from the journal. All right. So most of us these days, we will import the references from the journal or from a database like Web of Science. We'll import it into EndNote. And what happens when we do that? We import formatting from the journal. So just make sure that you're not importing formats like some journals, all the authors' names are in caps. Some journals, the title is all in caps. That formatting will get imported into EndNote. When you export it back out as a reference list, it will maintain that formatting, and then it's no longer in Harvard style. All right. So make sure when you read it, so Harvard style doesn't have the authors in all caps. It doesn't have the title in all caps. All right. So you have to make sure when you generate your reference list that there aren't any formatting errors. All right. And again, it's the same thing when I write a publication. If I send it off to a journal and they say it has to be in this format, and I give it to them in another format, they just send it back to me. All right, so it's not in the right format. That's a quick way to get your papers rejected. All right, if you don't adhere to the guidelines. Where to start? Read the literature. You get an idea, think about your topic, think about your questions, start reading the literature. All right. Come up with a clearly defined set of questions. All right. Think about the scope of those questions. Make sure they're realistic. Make sure it can be achievable within the time frame. Use the literature to support your methodology and justify the choice of methods from the published literature. And clearly show that your research proposal, the methods can actually address your research questions. Before you submit it as a group, make sure that you formatted it consistently, that all the parts of the people in a different group are all presented in the same way, so it doesn't look like three different people's bits of work just pasted together. So make sure you have a consistent format all the way through. Proofread it carefully. Use spell checkers and things like that. Give it to each other, give your work, make sure other people have read it. So peer review each other's work, make sure you're all happy with the work that's been submitted. I freely admit that I'm a bit of a pedant, and I get really annoyed if I read the first sentence of so at least make sure the first sentence is correct. So that if I read the first sentence, there's a typo in the first sentence, I go, like I'm banging my head on the desk just about. Not another one. So at least make sure there's no typos in the first paragraph. It'll make my life much happier. So proofread it carefully. You shouldn't have obvious typographical spelling errors because, you know, in Word, if it's spelt wrong, it typically has a little red squiggly line under it. So have a look at those things. You know, if you've jammed two words together, it'll come up as an error. So just read it carefully. Make sure you've reviewed each other's work. Make sure you use the right referencing style. Think about punctuation, grammar is correct. And again, Word is it does a reasonable job of identifying strange sentence construction, you know, the green wiggly lines you have under things. If you see some of those, think about whether it's correct or whether you're happy with what you've written. All right. And make sure you check the task description before you submit. So I just had a few things. So these are not what you need to think about for this assessment item, but if you're doing a real project, there's some things. So when you're actually doing it, you've got a whole lot of logistic things you're going to need to sort out, and I guess it's a bit of warning to you as students. Now, when you come to do your actual project, all right, no one's going to do it for you. No one's going to go and source all the materials and the equipment you need, all right? If it's important to you, you have to do it yourself, and you have to make sure that what you need is available when you need it, all right? So it's important that when you're thinking about your own research, you need to think about what's all the materials or consumables that I need for my project. All right? And you need to make sure that that's going to be available when you need it. You can't assume that you'll just turn up in the lab or turn up at a field site and everything you need is going to be there. All right? In reality, it probably won't be. And then you're going to be in problems. All right? So you need to make sure all the materials that you require, they're there for you when you need it. You need to think about, are there any safety inductions or safety requirements that I have to fulfill? So there's various things, you know, like if you're handling dangerous chemicals or using gases or you're working in a laboratory or doing field work or working in a remote location, there's a whole lot of paperwork and stuff you've got to fill in for safety. So make sure that if there are training requirements, if there are reporting requirements that you have to do, make sure you know about it and get them done early, all right? Because they can cause a lot of delays to your research project. Understand where you should be getting the materials from. Understand who's going to pay for it, all right? It's important. Is your supervisor expecting you to pay for it, or is the supervisor going to pay for it? All right? It's a lot easier to have that discussion up front. How long will it take to actually get delivered? And that can cause you problems. So if you think, well, I need it next week, I'm going to order it today, and it takes 6 weeks to arrive, that's a problem. All right? So think about how long some of these things are going to do. Sometimes things take months to be delivered. And if you've only got 8 months to do your project, you need to get onto those things at the beginning. So again, equipment, what do I need? Where is it? Is it available? Who's got it? Can I borrow it from someone? Does my supervisor have it? If I can't get this, can I use something else? Do I need to be trained? If I need to be trained, how long is it going to take? How much is that being used? I know that there's a lot of equipment food science students use that are heavily booked, and so it's important to make sure that some of that equipment, that you actually book it and you've got it scheduled well in advance. If you don't, sometimes you'll miss out. You need to think, sometimes you can use some equipment out of hours, like on the weekends or at nights. Sometimes you're not allowed to do that, all right? If you can use it on the weekends when the other people aren't using it as a student, sometimes that's good. But you need to make sure that you're actually allowed to do that, all right? Think about, is there any cost involved in running that equipment? All right, again, if there's a cost, who's going to pay for it? Timelines, managing your time as a student in your student project is really important to you, because if your project runs over time, what's the consequences of that? You don't graduate, you don't finish your project on time. All right. So it's really important that you think about the time frame, how long things are going to take, what things need to be done first. Do I have to do this before I do that? Are there what we call stop-go points in your research, where you get these results and that determines what you do next? All right, making some decisions about where you go from. Bottlenecks, where things might take a long time to get done. All right, might be only one piece of equipment that you can use, and so unless you get through that, you can't move on to the next step. All right. Think about your total workload as a student, what you have to do for your project, what you have to do for other classes that you're doing at the same time, and how you manage that. Whether you need to get help, maybe talk to your fellow students, see whether you can help one another at points where you have a lot of work to do. But it's really important to manage that time constraints, all right? Because if something goes wrong, if your project goes over time, you don't really have the opportunity to extend. So you need to really manage your time really carefully. Risk assessments, they are important and they often need to be done. And sometimes you can't do things unless you've completed a risk assessment. Sometimes it's already been done for whatever you're trying to do. All you need to then do is make sure you read and understand those risk assessments. Ethics approvals can take a long time. Human ethics, animal ethics. And again, if you're required to do that for your research, get onto it early, because those committees only meet once a month. And if you doesn't get through one committee meeting, then you've got to wait another month and resubmit. All right, and that can cause a lot of delays. Data collection, so information you're collecting, you have to be thinking before you collect it about how it's going to be stored, how it should be analysed, how it should be processed. Again, this is the thing often about time and resources that you need to understand. It's important, I believe, for your own project to think about, firstly, is it achievable? Is a total project something that can be done within the time? But also you need to think about what happens if something goes wrong. All right? What happens if this part of the project doesn't work? What happens if I can't do this because this piece of equipment's not available? Is there some other, like a fallback position? All right? Because again, you don't have the time, luxury of time, to say, well, I'll do that next year. All right? Because you don't have that time. So I was talking to honours students yesterday. I was really quite disappointed. Put in the field trials at Gatton this year, and we've got some sort of disease in the field site. All right, which is causing a stunting of my wheat trials. And even though I'm disappointed about it, I go, okay, what do I do about it? I probably can't get what I need from this. So I will harvest the seed and do it again next year. But that's okay for me. But if that was a student project, that would be problematic. All right. So if your whole project was dependent on that field trial, you can't do it next year. You have to have some other option. So think about contingencies. All right. And also you need to think about seasonal approaches, seasonal impacts. So can you actually do that work in winter time in China, for instance, if you're trying to do something? So if you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to do a project starting in second semester, and my field work will be in December, and then you think, well, December's summer here, but in China it's actually minus 20 degrees. am I actually going to be able to do that there? You know, can you actually physically get around at that time of year? If I'm going to grow something in the laboratory, in the field, can I grow it at that time of year? All right. If you're working with farmers, you know, you have to think, is that actually a good time to be doing interviews with farmers? How does it match in with their other work requirements? Are they going to be available to talk to me? Or I'm just going to be a pest? All right, so think about that. So, and also in your time management, you need to allow time for reading and thinking into the process. You need to allow time, so if you've collected samples and they've got to be analysed, sometimes in a laboratory, sometimes that can take a long time, particularly if there's lots of samples coming through, all right? Compiling and validating and checking your data can take a long time as well, all right? And you need to allow time for that. I said thinking and writing. Now, for most of us, writing takes a lot longer than we think it's going to take, even for people who English is their first language. So writing a major report like a thesis can be quite challenging, and it's a big piece of work. And as most of your grade depends on that written report, you want to do a good job of it. All right. So it's important when you're planning your time that you allow sufficient time to write and revise your final report, and you're not doing it in the 3 or 4 days before it's due. All right. So think about when you come to doing your research project, think about when everything is due, when do I have to submit the final report, when do I have to do my oral presentation, and from those 2 points, because they're fixed, you can then think back, okay, how much time before that do I need to have my data in hand in order to be able to analyse it appropriately and have enough time to think about those results and write up a meaningful report. And that's usually 6 weeks or something before you have to submit your report. All right, at least 6 weeks to give yourself sufficient time to think about that and to write and revise your final report a number of times. All right, so allow time for that in your schedule when you're thinking about things. All right, and it's not just people whose English is a second language. It's a skill you have to learn, and it's difficult often to write concisely and clearly and in such a way where you're not being ambiguous or can be misunderstood. And so that can take quite a while. The other thing is when you're actually doing it, there are things you can write before you finish. All right, so you've got a final report to write at the end of your second semester often, but you don't have to wait till the end to start writing. Start working on like your introductory sections. Start working on writing up your materials and methods sections, because you can write them up when you're actually doing it. All right, you don't have to wait till you get the results to do that. So start writing the sections as you go along, all right, rather than leaving it all to the end. Budget. Now, student projects often have really limited resources. Both, like I said, time is really constrained, but there's also limited financial resources. And for you as students, you need to negotiate that with your supervisor, all right? And make sure you understand who's going to pay for what, all right? And that you have a clear understanding of their expectations and your expectations so that it doesn't lead to problems later on. Different supervisors have different expectations there. You know, for me, I would normally expect to pay for all the costs associated with the project, but I know other people have different levels of expectation. So make sure that when you're negotiating that project and you're talking about it, that there's some discussion about how is it going to be paid for. All right. So, you know, you might say, oh, I want to do this back home in China and you say, well, I'm going to go home, see my family anyway on holiday, so I'm happy to pay for the airfare and then stay another 2 months and do the field work. So that might be part of the negotiation, all right? And you said, okay, I was going to do this anyway, so I'm happy to pay this, but then I'll need support for field work for 2 months to hire a car or whatever I need to do while I'm overseas, all right? So it's a discussion that you need to have, all right, as part of planning your project appropriately, all right? Questions about any of that? I'll turn on Gatton again. I could unmute you. Now I can hear you guys again. So questions about what we've talked about? Yes? You don't have to write that many words. It's a maximum, okay? What's the minimum? The minimum is required that someone can read and understand your proposal and implement it. All right, so you have to have sufficient information there that someone can read that and then implement your project. Right? So you don't have to, you're not required to reach the maximum. I just don't want to read any more than that, if that makes sense. So don't exceed the maximum, but you don't have to, but again, on the other side, don't submit a 3-page report. All right? Now, this is expected to be a comprehensive document that contributes a significant amount to your final grade, and so it should be a substantial report written by 3 people. All right? All right, so it's going to be, you know, a significant document, but you don't have to reach that max. So the criteria, I said, in terms of content, is you have to fully describe what you're planning to do to a level that if I read that, I potentially could implement it. All right? Does that make sense? Okay. And, but yeah, you don't have to achieve that. You don't have to have the maximum. All right? Other questions? No? I just don't want to see a 200-page report. One of my sons, when he was in high school, he was doing an assignment for one of his teachers, and he thought he would annoy his teacher by doing a really comprehensive report and kept sticking stuff into it. And then it backfired him because his teacher thought it was a fantastic report and it was the best thing he'd ever written, but he was just doing it to try to annoy her. But that was by putting in more stuff. But so it's not about, yeah, so make sure all the information is there. It's comprehensive in the sense that if someone can read it, read what you've written, so you have a clear outline of the methodologies that you're going to use and the steps that are involved. If you're going to do run a focus group, you should say, well, how am I going to run that focus group? How's it going to manage? How are the people going to be recruited into that? All right? Where are they going to come from? If I'm going to have a survey, then you need to have what the survey questions are. So that has to be there. Because if you don't have the survey, you say, I'm just going to run a survey. And then if I'm going to take your thing and how do I know the survey? You have to tell me the questions. Right? All right. If you're going to do a designed experiment, you have to specify the design and layout of that experiment. You have to specify what the treatments are. What am I going to measure on that experiment? How am I going to measure it? All right. So that when I read it, I go, okay, here's the design, here's the randomisation, here are the treatments. I could just go out and put that in the ground in my field site and I could do exactly what you want me to do. All right? So it has to be in that level of detail that someone reading it could do it, who has the appropriate skills and background information. All right? Does that make sense? All right, I didn't check whether we had any more enrolments. I checked last week, then I think we had 62 or something. So I needed to create another group, but I'll just check that again. But I couldn't figure out how to actually create another group. But I'll get help from Blackboard. All right, so enrol in groups. 2, get started on that. Start working together as groups. Start thinking about research questions, because you can think about that before you actually think about the methodologies. All right. Other questions? Anyone at Gatton got a question? I can see you and hear you. No questions from Gatton? We'll figure up here. All right, it's all perfectly clear. Maybe not. If it's not clear, send us some questions on Blackboard. All right. All right then, Gatton guys, I'm going to turn off the video link. So I'll be at Gatton next week. I'll see you guys out there next week, okay? All right. End the call. All right. Do you guys want to have a break for a couple of minutes, or you want to keep on going? Yes, he wants to have a break. No, we can take 5 minutes if you like. All right, maybe 10:35, something like that. I didn't bring a drink.